So, hello everybody. Yeah, it is my pleasure to start our presentation today together with Leiza Brumat. I'm really delighted that I can present some insights from our European Research Council project Prospects for International Migration Governance, which is led by Andrew Getz. But I also want to make a very warm shout out to our wonderful colleagues who are also in the room, Marcia Vera Espinosa in the back, Luca Lixi and Andrea Pretrakin. So, and the two of us will present on the Global Compact our thoughts from the perspective of our project. So I will jump right into the middle of what our research is about by quoting one interviewee from my fieldwork in North America. So I think the more I've been in government, the more I realize that senior officials, and not just in the Department of Homeland Security, but anywhere, are constantly making decisions with imperfect information. All they can do is rely on their experience and their judgment in an environment that is inherently uncertain and unpredictable, to be able to make the best decisions that they can at the time with the information they have. So this quote illustrates that any decision-making is always embedded in an environment of uncertainty and risks. So governance and governance responses are not simply about finding the right solutions to certain problems. It's about constructing, interpreting, and understanding these problems at the first place. So it is basically about what governance actors think, what is going on out there, and what should we do next. So in a nutshell, our research is very much about how people who make or shape decisions in the field of migration make sense of the issues they face, and how these understandings then affect or shape governance responses. So again, what is going on out there, and what should we do next? To put very plain. So to this end, what we did in this research project is we did more than 400 interviews in different world regions, and we were asking decision makers and shapers what they see as causes and consequences of international migration, and also we tried to get to understand what the impact of their own personal experience is, and also the impact of their organizational environment on their understandings. So in this sense, we approach the Global Compact from a slightly different perspective than the speakers before, namely, we see it as an outcome of sense-making processes. So we approach it, our main argument, plain and simply again, is understanding matters. They have real effects on outputs such as the Global Compact on Migration and the GCM process.
So, as Leila just said, we will focus on the Global Compact migration process, and why on the GCM? Well, basically because it's a very peculiar case of an agreement. Can you hear me well? It's a very peculiar case of a global agreement on migration in broad terms, which was a very unlikely scenario not so long ago. Migration, because migration at the global level is particularly characterized by the fact that there is a very high rate of fragmentation of legal norms. So the GCM was unlikely for many reasons, but there's a central one. Migration touches upon a core idea of the nation state, which is sovereignty. So then this indicates, the fact that this process is taking place, indicates that something has effectively changed. So that's why we ask, what has changed for this process to be possible and to be taking place right now? So, before the one, yeah. So what has changed? Well, from our research, we identify three main changes in the understandings which are centered on core concerns about governability that then lead to a perception of a crisis on governance. These changes are, in the first place, on the nature of migration itself, which is increasingly understood and viewed as a global issue, transnational, transregional, which, you know, this is also viewed in the language used in the Global Compacts. This affects every country in the world and redefines them as sending, receiving, and transit all at the same time. But the main thing here is that migratory pressure is perceived to be the new normality, which is here, something that is here to stay. In relation to this, we find a second change, that in the understanding about which is the level of responses that should be taken toward this new normality. As governance at the national level is perceived to be in crisis, then national governments are no longer capable of dealing with this pressure on their own. So responses and solutions should be sought at the global level. The third change, also in relation to this, is on the understandings about the type of response that is required. It should be proactive, but especially it should involve whole of government, whole society approaches, something that has been mentioned several times in this panel and can be also viewed in language used in the global compacts. Then we identify these changes in a very large number of the 400 plus interviews that we've done, and also in official documents. But here we will just to illustrate, we will show 3 quotes from European officials from European member states that are illustrative of these changes. First, we can see that migration is globalized, it's transcontinental. Then we can also see the interdependence of countries, which makes unilateral responses then less effective. Also, the idea of a constant crisis as the new normality. Also, in the next one, also we can see the multi-actor, cross-sectoral perspective, as well as the certainty, migration is a pressure that is here to stay, and that is at the top of the national, regional, and international agendas. For all these reasons, responses, again, are perceived to be more effective if done at the multilateral level. But why? Why did this happen now? Well, it's a nice one. Then understandings do not emerge in the void. As Elizabeth just mentioned at the beginning, it's part of a long process, but and they are particularly part of a context of an environment. These understandings have been particularly influenced, in this case, by the experience in Europe. The European crisis acted as a catalyst for the spread of the idea of ungovernability. It also opened a window of opportunity for certain international organizations to diffuse some understandings that they already had and have been already promoting from before. So with the crisis, these ideas could take over.
So to come to a conclusion, So to come to a conclusion, what is driving the GCM process? Or to be more accurate, what has changed that we now have a GCM process? So this very unlikely phenomena of having this process at all, which was very nicely explained also by the speakers before. So in a nutshell, what we argue is that it's a shift on understandings which are very much centered on the idea that migration has become ungovernable at the nation-state level alone. So major objectives, such as preventing unwanted migration, have remained the same. So it's not to say that the major priorities changed, but the approaches on how to achieve these objectives, those ones have changed. So despite old priorities, as well as old power relations, which we very much see as ongoing in this process, we conclude that the shifting approaches might also open up new opportunities. So what do I mean with new opportunities? I mean, think of also what was discussed previously, because now we have new actors, new perspectives, new interactions. And again, we want to illustrate this with material from our fieldwork. So for instance, this is a government official from Germany who underlines that really the inclusion of new actors has indeed provided new perspectives, or another one, so the next one, Or as one of the key diplomats we interviewed negotiating the GCM in the Global South put it, I can assure you that no delegation nowadays thinks exactly the same about international migration since we started the negotiations. So, next one, So with this note, I want to thank you, first of all, for your attention just before lunch to still are hopefully awake and listening to us. And also we want to mention that governance and questions of governability are very much at the core of our research here also at the Migration Policy Center, and it's really an evolving and growing endeavor we have. And one of our next stops we also wanted to mention in that regard is a conference on the governability of migration we're hosting in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And yes, so with this, let me thank you again, and I'm looking very much forward to the discussion.
And hosting a conference in Argentina is not exactly a difficult ask for people to come and attend.
In spring.
In spring, everyone, it'll be nice. I particularly enjoyed the cartoons. I think I identify most with Charlie Brown lying on his back shouting, "Why?" But I'm intrigued. I just wanted to ask how much of this changing drive that's come from crisis, that crisis has created an opportunity, and part of that opportunity is the Global Compact. How much of that is opportunity-driven versus fear-driven? And if there were to be a resumption of crisis, if they found themselves back in the same position so quickly after 2015, 2016, do you think it would reinforce, based on your interviews, reinforce the idea that we should definitely move to a global process, or bring much more of a defensive, that didn't work, we're going to do things on our own now approach? I mean, do you have any indications from your interviews?
So I think you mentioned two very, very important aspects. And if it's opportunities or fear-driven, and frankly, I would say it's both, but then depending on which actors you look at. I think for certain actors, and certainly, of course, for international organizations, it is also an opportunity. Also the agenda, what Leiza said before also, the agenda they promoted, and of course, the more you go to the global international level, the more legitimation also international organizations have. So in this sense, it is, we would say, it is an opportunity, but of course, when you look at member states, I mean, the whole evolution of the Global Compact, which was never meant to be there in the first place, was very much fear-driven, of course, from certain regions, certain parts in African countries who wanted to have this on the table next. So not only having a compact on refugees negotiated. So of course, so in this sense, it's both. And what you say about the scenario about, will they upscale, so to say, go back to the national? I think in this regard, what we have to think about, we shouldn't think out of the global and the national level and national sovereignty as opposed ends. I think they very much go together. So also, like ideas or like interests nation states want to pursue, if they see they can pursue it better at the global level, they will do it. I mean, so I think it's not that it's two different opposing ends.
Yeah, it's not just about global or retreat. It's not about, yes, sovereignty or non-sovereignty, is about managing sovereignty by other means as well.
And so it's looking at different interests and where you can manage those interests at different levels.
Yep.
We have reached the glasses on portion of this session, which means I'm now looking to you for questions to our panel. I think there is an enormous amount of expertise sat on this panel, and I personally have about 10 different questions.